Thank you very much for the introduction, Dr. Madani, and thank you very much to the Iran Heritage Foundation, to Dr. Borbor, and to everyone involved in putting this conference together. I must say I've been surprised and very interested in the different aspects of talking about the same thing. So some of the visuals may actually coincide with everyone else's presentation in some ways, but it is a different interpretation. And I hope that, I know it's very close to lunchtime and everyone wants to, must be hungry, but I hope that we can have enough to cause a good deal of discussion and exploration of new ways of looking at our history. So I'm going to begin. Let me start with saying that in some ways the title of my talk should have been Complexities and Contradiction in Architecture. And to give you a definition of modernism as we look at the context of Iran and where Iran is situated. But in looking at the city of Tehran as it is today, and some of the images of the city as a very large metropolis, and no one can give you the exact number of its population, but it's well over 12 million. So let me start with Marshall Berman's definition of modern. To be modern, he says, is to live a life of paradox and contradiction. It is to be overpowered by the immense bureaucratic organizations that have the power to control and often to destroy communities. And he goes on to say that it is to be both revolutionary and conservative, alive to new possibilities for expression and adventure, and frightened by the nihilistic depths to which so many adventures lead. We might say that to be fully modern is to be anti-modern. So with that intent, we can see that Tehran in some ways embodies the definition of modernity according to Marshall Berman. So we saw the high-rises, and Tehran is very much a vertical city, as we noted this morning, but it's also a city of the scale of the human being, and very much the traditional city that was part of the 19th century and early 20th century legacy. But it is a city of contradictions and images that could be anywhere. And in fact, some of them are from anywhere. The building that you saw in Tehran is an identical building to one that was actually replicated from one in Philadelphia. So that kind of application we see all over China. It started in Iran many, many years ago, and it still continues. So in some ways, Tehran is the embodiment of some of Iran's encounters with modernity. So many of the examples here will be from the city of Tehran. And we all know the Monument to Freedom. It is the symbol of Tehran. And it is interesting that it is the symbol, but very few people have actually met the architect and know that this architect is a very significant person in the history of modern architecture in Iran. Principally, we saw just our last speaker's discussion was wonderful about the geometry of the building. In fact, the approach that I've taken, and as a historian, I've written about Le Corbusier, a book about him, I've written about Frank Lloyd Wright, about Walter Gropius, about Alvar Aalto, Joe Ponti, and it is with that approach of really knowing modern architecture in the West that I have studied and looked at and interviewed many of these architects. So much of what I say about modernism is based on actually talking to some of the participants in the movements, beginning with Fouroughi. I was a student of Iraj Ehtesam. I was 20, but I really it's been a great honor to have been among his students. So I've divided the history, very much as he did, into the 4 eras. And it's pretty evident that in many ways, architecture is a sensitive measure of culture, and it coincides with historical and political events. In fact, my case in point is that architecture is the most political of all arts. So how am I looking at it, and what am I saying that's slightly different from the interpretations? The criteria that I use to understand the different eras are these: patronage, whether it is private or public, the state I call it; technology, both in terms of the infrastructure and building; social forces, whether it's cultural, economic, religious, etc., and the architects, who were the actual builders, both foreign and local. So in each era, we will see this, and I will go very quickly because you've seen many images. But Tehran in the early end of the 18th century, early 19th century, was very much a traditional city. In fact, the earliest map was made by a Russian, and you can see all of the elements of the historically Islamic city. Before going further, this is a time when Iran's relationship with the rest of the world dramatically changes, and I think that is reflected within the architecture. And Iran has lost a lot of its property or its land to Russians, and it's become a pawn. It's never been colonized by either Russia or Great Britain, partly because they were always competing against one another for domination. And in some ways, the psyche of Iran was formed by this transformation that occurred in political history of Iran. So Tehran, the earliest map, the map by a wonderful, I call this the Noli map of Tehran, because in many ways it has the same kind of information that the Noli map of Rome has for Rome. It has the public and private parts of the city. It's a wonderful map, and it was the inspiration for my own study of the areas of Tehran back when I was a student of Dr. Ehtesam in Tehran University. So I actually took the map and went and studied the areas of the city that were still there, Udlajan in particular, and I documented more than 150 houses. By the way, more than 80% of all those houses were destroyed in the post-revolutionary period. So again, the criteria, and if we look at a map of Tehran as an Islamic city, and I call it an Islamic city because there is a distinct connection, and I showed it before, that there were, the city was, the walls of the city were built in the Safavid period during the time when religion played a very important role, and there were 114 towers corresponding to the 114 towers of the Quran around the city of Tehran. And the individual pieces of the city, I think if I go back, and this is Fatali Shah, and just a few of the images that are related to it. But the elements of the city were very distinct. The royal citadel, the walls, and the bazaar, a very important part of the triumvirate of the power, the mosque, the congregational mosque, and then the mahalles. And when the city of Tehran was expanded under Nasiruddin Shah, I have to go, sorry, I just wanted to show one, I think the slide is missing. Sorry. It had the original city had these elements: the walls, the gateway, the citadel, the bazaar, the congregational mosque, the maidan, and the mahalles. And this diagram of the definition of the parts of the city continued when the city was expanded. And these are just examples of some of these elements drawn by not in photographs as much as in images and paintings. So when the city was expanded under Nasiruddin Shah and the walls were built according to the walls of Paris, of Vauban, and it was very much a continuation of the same traditional elements within the city. The only part of the city that was slightly different was the Mahalle Dolat, the area north of the city, which you see here, with palaces to the royal, for the royal elite and for the Europeans who were coming to the city. The early legations were also built in this area. But the same idea of the gateways were continued and multiplied. There were 12 gateways now in the city of Tehran. And these were all built in this very oriental fashion, but also influenced by the imagery of the West that the Shah himself had made 3 trips to Europe, and he was very much enchanted by some of the European architecture. So you have the Naderi street here being the first European-style street in Tehran. And Nasiruddin Shah's own palace was, again, the opulence and such were reminders of his visits to Versailles and other buildings, but it was an oriental interpretation. And in many ways, the first and most important modern building, as we heard, was the Shams-ul-Emare, and it was built by Dustali Khan Muayyar al-Mamalik. He had actually traveled himself abroad, and while many of the early modernist architects of the late Qajar period were looking only to postcards to copy the West, he had actually seen the West, and he was building this palace and, somewhat influenced by British architecture, Big Ben, and the clock was a sign of modernity. But in many ways, the plan is very much a traditional plan and not unlike the building of Esfahan. So while it looks on the facade to be modern, it has the structural elements of it are very traditional. So while new buildings were introduced, they continued the same tradition. In fact, the largest mosque, the Sepah Salar Mosque, at this time was built by a private individual, one of the courtiers, and given to the city. It was also very much a building that reinforced the Qajar traditions. And you had also the introduction of the takiye. There were lots of takiyes all over the city. These were public places for people to see religious ceremonies. In fact, during the Qajar period, and as a counterpoint to the Western influence over Iran in some ways, the Iranian government and the state assumed a more direct religious and in some ways introverted approach to the design of public spaces in Tehran. And so there is the concept of zahir wa batin, the introversion and extroversion of the spaces and the cultural identity of Iran as well. And you have very much a lifestyle that is the interior, and this is the exterior of that magnificent interior. So the exterior oftentimes was very simple and not reflective of the glory that you had inside. Most of the buildings were around courtyards, and so the image of Tehran as an introverted city is very much that of the late 19th century. And you had the mahalles where the facade of the buildings to the outside street was very simple, but on the inside you had a much more opulent courtyard, and in most of the mahalles, in most of the neighborhoods, you had both the rich and the poor living together. They oftentimes came from different regions, so they had cultural connections, but rich and poor were living together, something that would dramatically change later on. And you had a very interesting case study of the doorknobs reflecting the person knocking on the door. I found this out during my 150 relevés and measurements that I made. I knocked by mistake the wrong knocker, and I was chastised for doing that. So on the interior, and very much throughout the Qajar period, the women were hidden. So the baten, the andarun, the place where the interior life took place, is here depicted. And this was the Tehran that Reza Shah, Reza Khan, who was the Cossack general who came to power at the end of the Qajar period in 1925. He assumed he became the king. How many are Iranian here? And how many live in Iran? So maybe some of the things I'm saying is politically incorrect. I don't know. I noticed that. But what Reza Shah did, I can't say Reza Khan. I grew up in a time when we called him Reza Shah, so I'm sorry for continuing that. It's fine. So you have the creation of the new Tehran that was very much the infrastructure and the structural composition of the city would be dramatically changed. This is what is part of the definition of what happened in the 15-year period. And he ruled basically for 20 years, and during 15 years is when all of these transformations happened. And Meydan-e-Sepah that you see here became the main principal area. Again, the tradition of having the Meydan, or the public square, was there, part of Iranian culture, but it was a transformation of making that into a place where automobiles were paramount, and it was a symbolic space more than a public gathering place, although later on it would become a gathering place. And he basically demolished all of the gateways. And people think that that's a horrible thing that happened, but in many ways, the people who were living in the city were not very happy with these gateways, because the gateways were the points of control. And so by destroying these points of control, in some ways, he was democratizing the city. And the only new gateway that he built was in the Champ de Mars, the marching grounds of the royal, old royal area, but now the administrative headquarters. So he took the royal palace, and he actually, in terms of the infrastructure, he completely changed the scale, and this is Shah Reza near the Ferdowsi Square. And he took the royal palaces that we saw, and he demolished the palaces and created major public institutions. And most of these institutions were new institutions. So while Tekke-i-Dolat was demolished, the Bank of Bazar was built in its stead. It actually does not exactly coincide, the footprint. They could have kept it, but they destroyed it, partly because the agenda of Reza Shah was to secularize the nation, to modernize it, very much in the vein of Ataturk. And he was very much a nationalist. So creating a nation state as opposed to the religious state was an important part of what he did, including the fact that he actually went to the archaeological sites, and he could have, in this very picture, said, okay, that's the image I want on my bank, or on my police headquarters. But he was very much influenced by the archaeological excavations that were being done exactly at that time. So much of what we see and why the proportions are so good and the architectural early postmodernism of Iran is so successful is because they were actually using the original drawings of the archaeological excavations that were being done at that time. So in many ways, these are buildings built by extraordinary talented architects. I think that Gevrekian, who studied at the Beaux-Arts, and we've seen his relationship with Le Corbusier, he was building for his client. And if this client wanted something traditional, he would do the same. So the National Bank was designed by Markov, who was a Russian Cossack general, just like Reza Shah, and in fact they knew each other personally. You can see this is Markov and this is Reza Shah in the battalion. So when he was designing his own palace, Reza Shah instead chose a very traditional style of his time, and the Kach Marmar was built by Leon Tatavusian as one of the architects of it, and he explained how when he was talking to Reza Shah actually told him he wants the dome of the Sheikh Lutfullah Mosque on his building. So the fact that it was there is because of that. And you had the influx of foreign architects. Reza Shah was building new institutions, and he did not have the tools to do it with the people in Iran. He wanted to create those tools, including the architectural, including the university, and I think that's one of the lasting legacies of that period. But the person who came to Iran was an archaeologist by profession, as well as an architect, André Godard, and he was he built this building with a precise understanding of the geometry and the architectural merits of the Sasanian building. So I think that in many ways they merit a more careful study of how they represented the intercultural exchange of the time. And Godard went on to head the University of Tehran's first school of architecture. And so I'm going to go a little bit quicker, but Reza Shah's influence on every aspect of the country really was dramatic and transformative. And you had the creation of Maidans, you had the influx of modern architects like Roland Dubrul. This is the Amjadieh Stadium, the creation of sports facilities, universities, ministries. And you had people like Gevrekian building for the private sector. So besides the government, the state was the principal client, but in many ways the private sector also was beginning the emergence of the new middle class who was being educated was important. But I think one of the most important things is also the personalities who came into Iran at this time. One of them was Arthur Upham Pope, who led major expeditions throughout Iran, and he was able to document and really present Iran in expositions to the West. And I'm going to show a small video.
Walled in on the north by the imposing ramparts of the Elburz Mountains, the capital, Tehran, is a modern city compared to what it was 2 decades ago. In a beautiful setting, the city has wide tree-lined avenues of asphalt and modern buildings. This modernization was begun by His late Majesty Reza Shah, who has been severely criticized for his methods, but who did much for his country in modernizing its education, transport, cities, health programs, and industry. Many modern buildings have been erected. Although effective in simplicity, some of them, like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, do not make use of Iran's own rich architectural tradition. We look across Tehran's main square, the Meydan-i-Sepah, toward the Imperial Bank of Iran, a handsome building, a good combination of Persian and Byzantine architecture. Part of Reza Shah's program to beautify the cities of Iran was the planning of lovely parks and gardens. There are many present-day buildings which do effectively use characteristics of old Persian style, like the National Bank, utilizing elements of Achaemenid architecture, with slender fluted columns and a dorsed bull's head capitals. The police headquarters is an imposing modern building. one of the first and still one of the most successful. The museum was built in the Sasanian style. Most of the country's transport is handled by trucks and buses. Part of the new Persia's development has been the installation of up-to-date gas stations.
So it goes on, but it's an interesting picture of what happened and the aspects of modernism that the culture was pursuing. In 1941, Reza Shah was ousted, and in fact, it was because he had German engineers working and he had not been willing to get rid of them. Mohammad Reza Shah was made the new monarch, and you had the continuation of the secularization and the modernization program in Iran. You also had very much a much more fluid exchange with the West. While Reza Shah had only gone to Turkey and refused to go to other places, the Shah of Iran traveled all over the world, including to America, and was very much aware of the influence and the presentation of Iran to the West. So much of what we see during his time period reflects that. Even in the architecture, we see a new approach towards a monumentality that is made for the larger world to know. And he was very much involved. This is the Shah with Haydar Qiyai, one of the important architects of this time period. And so Tehran really became a much larger city. Over the course of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, it grew exponentially to over 4.5 million in 2 decades. And much of the city grew to the north, and there developed a north-south divide, and you had the influx of architects from all over the world. Iran, in a way, became a place where many architects who the oil crisis had caused them to lose their work in the West, they converged upon Iran. So you have Kenzo Tange, you have IMP, you had major firms like SOM, Skidmore, Owens and Merrill, Perkins and Will, Llewellyn Davis. A number of these architects came to Iran. You had the creation of the Shahyad, or now the Azadi Monument, the museum by Kamran Diba, Hans Hollein's, the renovation of a Qajar building into a modern museum. Again, very much the continuation of what the West was also doing, of taking historic preservation and taking a modern approach to it. But the largest project of this time period was the Shahistan Pahlavi, a huge administrative headquarters envisioned in the northern hills of Abbasabad. And you had the firm of Llewellyn Davis, which is a British firm, but in fact, most of the people working with him were from Mayor of New York, Mayor Lindsay's team. So these were the young Turks who were working for Mayor Lindsay, all converging upon Tehran and having their own lives be transformed by it. And Louis Kahn was also designing in this complex. And although it was not built, it would have a major impact on modern architecture in everywhere. So I'm going to go through quickly. This is Shahistan Pahlavi. This is Pardisan, the environmental park that again impacted much of the development of the new approach towards ecological planning that we have all over the world. And Ian McHarg himself was working on this project. And you had people like Frank Lloyd Wright actually designing and building for Iran. This is a house by Frank Lloyd Wright that was never built, but it was actually designed for a place in Yavaran. And it's an extraordinary piece of his architecture that grew out of his collaboration with an Iranian, young Iranian architect who worked on the Baghdad project and later brought that commission to Iran for the design of the Koch Shams. And it's an interesting combination of some of the influences, the house that he designed, Frank Lloyd Wright designed for Marilyn Monroe in Hollywood. And this is the building as it stands today, very much in need of some renovation. It has been ignored for 37 years. And it was inspired by the opera house that Wright had designed for Baghdad. And this is the Marilyn Monroe Arthur Miller House. And this was Nizam Amiri, who worked with Frank Lloyd Wright as an apprentice and became Wright's sort of main collaborator on the Baghdad project. And this is Amiri in London prior to his, sadly, he's passed away. The new campus for Damavand, also a Frank Lloyd Wright inspired, built by Wes Peters and the Frank Lloyd Wright firm with the collaboration of Amiri, but very much based on that. And so this is the Tehran of that era, and very much an extroverted city, living its life outside, and that's the Tehran that ended in 1979 with the revolution. And it became the same city that under the previous regime had its master plan, again done with Aziz Farmayan, together with the American and European collaborators. And that plan is still continuing. So Tehran is very much structurally the city that was designed in the 1970s and 80s. And this is the city that we see of highways, and very much a city in search of an identity. And in some ways, maybe it'll be the same as Tokyo, where its lack of identity will become one. I think that the young and old exist together. And in some ways, the image that I showed of Iran in the beginning, it was a National Geographic. It's a film. It was made as a poster for an image of a cinema. And I think that Iranian cinema is a great opportunity to look at ways in which Iranian culture can be reflected in its architecture as well. And I end with a few images of, just two images of Iran's participation for the first time in the Venice Biennale, the Architecture Biennale. And here you will see some of the works that we saw in our last lecture. Second time? 14, okay, yeah. So, and I end with this image that reminds me of what Frank Lloyd Wright said about Iranian architecture, that it is one of the highest levels of architecture in brick. And thank you.